Okay, now we get to our gospel passage, which continues to move through the Gospel of Luke. We're in chapter 18, verses 9 through 14. Jesus addressed this parable to those who were convinced of their own righteousness and despised everyone else. Two people went up to the temple area to pray. One was a Pharisee, and the other was a tax collector. The Pharisee took up his position and spoke this prayer to himself. O God, I thank you that I am not like the rest of humanity, greedy, dishonest, adulterous, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week, and I pay tithes on my whole income. But the tax collector stood off at a distance and would not even raise his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast and prayed, O God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, the latter went home justified, not the former. For whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and the one who humbles himself will be exalted. Okay, great. So this goes hand in hand with last week's gospel passage, which began by Luke telling us that he told a parable, Jesus told a parable about the necessity for them to pray always without becoming weary. So these two parables are only found in Luke's gospel, and it's really rare, it might even be the only time, where there's an explanation of the parable before the parable itself. In other words, Luke is telling us, like, this is why he's telling this parable. Which is an interesting thing to think about, because you think of Jesus as he's teaching his apostles or his disciples or whoever it is that's listening to him. As he's teaching, he doesn't say, like, okay, now I'm going to tell you a parable about those who who were convinced of their own righteousness and despised everyone else. Now I'm going to tell you that parable. No, he told the parable, and then they maybe had to figure it out. Maybe they had to ask him about it. Who knows? But Luke is giving us a clue so that we can just know ahead of time what's going on. Because so the Pharisees, this is a strange thing. We're so familiar with the gospel, probably. Even if we're not actually familiar with it, we are familiar with hearing it. And so when we think of Pharisees, we naturally think of, oh, these are the bad guys that Jesus is critical of, and he's always seeking to correct them, and they reject him. And we think of tax collectors, and we think, oh, these are the people that Jesus reaches out to and invites to be his disciples. And so for us, we have this idea in our minds that Pharisees are bad guys, tax collectors, well, they turn out to be good guys in the end. But for the original audience that Jesus is speaking to, it would have been the opposite, that the Pharisees were understood to be the good guys. They were known to live lives that were really separate from the societal pressures of the day. People that we in today's world would say that those people are holy. They're living a life that is set apart. In fact, I think the word Pharisee, it means one who is separated. So actually, they were highly respected in the Jewish society of Jesus. They were very influential in the way that they interpreted the law and the way that they called people to live the law. Whereas tax collectors, they were known to be the great betrayers of the Israelites, of the Jewish people, because they were Jewish, but they let themselves be employed by Rome to collect taxes from the Jewish people. And many times they would over-collect taxes so that they themselves could become wealthy. So for Jesus to tell this parable about two people going to the temple area to pray, one a Pharisee and the other the tax collector, it's very possible that the disciples were like, oh man, Jesus is going to give it to the tax collector. He's going to say that that guy shouldn't even have been in the temple because he's just such a wicked man. Oh man, I can't wait. They're just eager, oh, that Pharisee, he's going to come out on top in this whole story. It's very possible that would have been their mentality. And maybe, this is chapter 18, so maybe by this point in the life of Jesus, some of them had caught on. But the Gospels are also pretty clear that the disciples, they just don't quite get it until after the resurrection and the ascension and Pentecost. So they might even know that there's something in Jesus or someone in Jesus. Some of them are more clear-sighted perhaps, but many of them they understand that Jesus is important and so they're following him, but they don't fully grasp the fullness of what he's preaching about. So for them, they're just oh, I can't wait for Jesus to just give the right hook to the tax collectors, to just call them out for their problem. So anyway, so for Luke to say okay, this actually is what's going on here. And so as you're listening to this parable, pay attention to the one who is convinced of his own righteousness and despises everyone else. Pay attention to that person, the person who we might say is prideful and arrogant. Listen to that. Listen for that one. So anyway, so the Pharisee took up his position which he rightfully had as a religious leader. He had a particular spot in the temple area, the court of the priests, perhaps, or if he wasn't a priest, then at least the court of Israel. But in the court of Israel, perhaps there were even different distinctions of where people could stand. And so the Pharisee, being a Pharisee, perhaps was up toward the front of that area. And this is where we start to run into our first little red flag, because Jesus is saying the Pharisee took up his position and spoke this prayer to who? To himself. So that's like a little red flag, because he's praying to himself, and he refers his prayer saying, "Oh God, I thank you." So if he's praying to himself and he's saying, "Oh God," who's his God? Well, Jesus is certainly implying that his God is himself, that he's made a God out of himself. He's blinded himself to his lack of humility, we could say. So anyway, so he says, "Oh God, I thank you that I'm not like the rest of humanity, greedy, dishonest, adulterous, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I pay tithes on my whole income." And so I think something that really needs to be probably emphasized is that, so clearly, clearly towards the end, Jesus is going to say, the latter went home justified, not the former. So the tax collector goes home justified and not the Pharisee. And so we can hear that and we can think, so does that mean I'm not supposed to do good works? Does that mean I'm not supposed to fast and pay tithes on my whole income, and that I'm not supposed to recognize that there are wicked deeds that people commit and avoid them? And that's not the point that Jesus is getting across at all here. And to that, I think let's finish the parable, and then we'll talk about the distinction between the two. So the tax collector stood off at a distance and would not even raise his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast and prayed, "Oh God, be merciful to me, a sinner." And he's the one that goes home justified. So he stands off at a distance. So also in the temple area, so also probably in the court of Israel, but perhaps toward the back of the crowd, because the court of Israel was, there was some depth to it. And he beat his breast and he prayed. It doesn't say he prayed to himself, but he actually prayed to God, "Be merciful to me, a sinner." So let's just sort of make this observation. So the Pharisee stands close, whereas the tax collector stands far off. The Pharisee is clearly proud because he's praying to himself. He's talking about all of his accomplishments, whereas the tax collector is clearly humble. He wouldn't even raise his eyes to heaven. And again, maybe justifiably so. He knows that he's a tax collector. He knows that he's perhaps betrayed God's people. And there's humility in that recognition. The Pharisee, he judges other people. Like, "I thank you that I'm not like these people who are greedy, dishonest, and adulterous, or even like this tax collector." Whereas the tax collector, he doesn't look at other people. He judges who? He judges himself. "Be merciful to me, a sinner." The Pharisee prays to himself, whereas the tax collector prays to God. So we have this contrast here, and in the end, Jesus says that it was the tax collector who was justified, who was, we could say, forgiven of his sins, who was in a right relationship with God, whereas the Pharisee, as uncomfortable as it may have been for Jesus's audience to have to acknowledge this, the Pharisee was not justified. He was, we could say, maybe not forgiven of his sins, not in a right relationship with God. And again, this can be a tricky thing, but what is, I tell you, say, whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and the one who humbles himself will be exalted. So again, this gets back to our first reading, if you can remember the first reading, where it says, "The prayer of the lowly pierces the clouds." And the tax collector, clearly, he wouldn't raise his eyes to heaven. He beats his breast. He says, "God, be merciful to me, a sinner." He clearly recognizes, I need mercy. Whereas the the Pharisee is all about his credentials, which again, remember that the Lord, the Lord is a God of justice. He knows no favorites. He doesn't look upon a person's status and reputation, but instead he looks into the heart and to recognize, is this person relying on me or not? Is this person totally dependent on my grace or not? And clearly, according to what we're seeing here, the Pharisee was listing off his own credentials. You could pose it this way, why should God let you into heaven? And the Pharisee saying, well, look what I do. Look at all the things that I am. Look who I am. I'm not like these other people. Whereas the tax collector is like, he shouldn't let me into heaven unless he's merciful. If he's merciful to me, then I'm all about receiving that mercy. And that can be a little uncomfortable because, again, in the Catholic world, we actually talk about how it's really important for us to carry out good works. But this gets back to really our open collect. Why do we do the good works? We're doing the good works not because we feel like we can earn our salvation. We're doing the good works because we recognize that God has given us such grace, because we're responding to his grace. It's not that we're earning his grace, we're responding to his grace that, yes, then carries its own merits. It carries rewards, because Jesus tells us that. But if he hadn't told us that our works merit rewards, then we would have no reason to expect that there would be rewards coming to us. It's the fact that he's told us this. It's the fact that he's called us to follow after him that we then respond to that grace. And so if ever we end up turning in on ourselves and praying to ourselves and saying, look how good I am, or I'm doing all these incredible things, and without putting that in its proper reference points to, like, God has been so good to me, and so I'm now responding. But if it's just like, no, I'm just doing this because I want to get to heaven, then it's like we're relying more on our own works, our own efforts, than we are on God's grace. It always has to be put in its proper context, which is that, yes, I need to do good works. I need to not be dishonest. I need to not be greedy, to not be adulterous. I need to not betray God's people like a tax collector did at the time of Jesus. But that's not what's going to earn me salvation. What's going to get me to heaven is God's mercy. And the fact that he's been merciful, it reminds me, it shows me that I need to be humble in his sight, to not just have a spirit of entitlement, but I need to be humble before him, recognizing that everything I have is a gift. And even my own response is because of his grace that he's given to me. This might be really challenging for some of us because we don't necessarily look at it in that way. It might be really challenging for some of us because it might feel like, well, Jesus is condoning or giving permission for us to be unrighteous, for us to be wicked. And it can feel that way. Or even just like for me, as I think about preaching it, I feel like sometimes preaching about it is encouraging people in their sin. And that's not at all the case. Like to talk about God's mercy and our need for God's mercy, it can be scandalous sometimes. It can be uncomfortable for us sometimes. And I don't think we should just let ourselves off the hook by any means. You know this if you've been tuning into this Bible study. If you tune into anything that I say, you know that. But at the same time, I think it is just clear, like, more than anything else, you and I need God's mercy. And it is only by his mercy that we will be able to enter into eternal paradise, regardless of how virtuous we are, regardless of how much we live a holy life and seek to live a life of good works. Regardless of all of that, it is only because of his mercy that we will be able to enter into his kingdom. Because without his mercy, we are bankrupt. Without it, we're bankrupt. And so we need it. And the good news, of course, is that he provides it. He does provide it, and so we can respond accordingly. We can respond with our good works and with our lives of righteousness. But that's not what gets us there. What gets us there is his initial movement. It's his initiative upon us, which is so good. And I think we're actually going to see this. We're going to see this when we look at our second reading. The second reading isn't always connected with the gospel in the first reading, but this week I think there's just some really good connections. So we will see you for that. Peace.